All right, welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs on Tuesday, January 9th. We're here for the second half of our Tuesday afternoon is going to be devoted to a look at government accountability. And I wanted to start with a bill that was referred to us last year. And I appreciate Representative Stebbins joining us to introduce H194, and I think her thoughts on this may contribute to our discussion of the Summer Government Accountability Committee's report and the future work we have in fleshing out and understanding their recommendations. So Representative Stebbins, thanks for being the opening act of our government accountability work this year.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. And for the record, I'm Gabrielle Stebbins. I'm a representative serving the south end of Burlington. And my day job, when not a state rep, is I manage a lot of projects and programs, and I do a lot of evaluation of how states are doing with various energy programs. So across the 50 states, looking at how different groups of people are rolling out programs that state legislators give them. So first of all, thank you so much. When I was first elected back in 2021, I co-sponsored a bill that actually called for a working group to look at what we should do. So thank you very much for having that working group last summer. If you notice, H194 is a short form bill. Basically, after working on we should have a working group concept, I stepped back and I said, there really just needs to be committee discussion and testimony and a lot more weigh-in from folks who audit programs and evaluate policies to see how they're working. So that's why it's a short form bill. But in the event you haven't read it recently, I'll just read it to you quickly. The bill proposes to create the Legislative Office of Government Accountability and Strategic Planning in the legislative branch to assist the General Assembly in 1, monitoring and improving the performance of state government, 2, evaluating the operations and efficacy of state agencies, departments, and programs, 3, developing strategies to harness Vermont's strengths through prioritized investments in individuals and businesses, the economy, the natural environment, and infrastructure. 4, assessing the extent to which state government is sufficiently and appropriately staffed to meet its obligations. And 5, ensuring that public funds are being used appropriately and in the manner for which they were appropriated or otherwise allocated. So I know you're going to get a rundown in a moment from the summer group. I'm really grateful for their work. They have a lot of recommendations, including some recommendations. Like, it would be great if we got some reports back more like November 15th so we could implement them into bill making and sponsoring. I want to just set the table a little bit, though, which is I really don't see this as a party-based bill. The founders of our government proposed 3 branches of government, and they thought they should be equal: executive, judicial, and the legislature. We don't have that in Vermont. We have a citizen-based legislature. We're part-time, we're seasonal, we don't have staff. And 2 of the elements that came through when I read the summer study working group, one was 80% of the rest of the US states have some form of tracking back to legislators to tell them, hey, that bill you passed really isn't serving your constituents. Or, you know what, this bill could be improved this way. Or maybe you should pour more money into this program and less money into this program. So 80% other states have this. And on top of the fact that we're citizen-based, we're part-time, seasonal, with no staff, we also have the 3rd smallest legislative council office. So we're really trying to do a lot within, a certain box. And as a project manager, I don't know if you guys have seen, there's this triangle where you can either increase how much money you spend or reduce how much time. It's basically cost, time, or quality. And if you put tons of money at something, then you can get it done really fast and you can get it done really well. If you don't put much money at something, then maybe maybe it's not done on time and it's done really well, or maybe it's not done very well, but it's done on time. And the point to all of this is, how do we know if we're serving Vermonters if we don't know what the impacts of our laws and the implementation of those programs, what those impacts are? How do we know? And they're not all 13 of us, but although we probably, some of us disagree on what the role of government should be or the size of government and how much money we should put to state government, I'm fairly certain we all ran because we wanted to make Vermont a better place according to what we think for Vermonters, if it's our friends or our neighbors or our vets or whomever. So I really hope, and I'm so grateful that you're picking up this bill. I don't know how we improve upon our work if we are not tracking the data and coordinating across agencies and assessing what's working and what's not. Let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to say. I guess the other major piece that I wanted to say is that the challenge here is cost, right? Like, how much do you put into assessing how we're performing? And there's a saying in the data world: junk in, junk out. If you put in junk data, you're going to get junk data out. So the other piece is, how do you ask the right questions to figure out to make sure you're getting the answers back that you really want, so that then you can make the informed choice as to how to move forward. Do you change a law? Do you change a program? Do you get rid of a program? But we can see this across decades. If it's EB5, if it's our last our last budget vote, with at the last minute trying to figure out what was going on with housing and the unhoused, we need some mechanism to have a better report back in terms of what's going on and how we can serve better our constituents and our neighbors.
Yeah, so I want to recognize that our House co-chair of the Summer Government Accountability Committee has just joined us, Representative Stebbins, and was saying, yes, that's what we're talking about. That's government accountability. So we are hearing, I wanted to give Representative Stebbins the opportunity to introduce H194, her short form bill, which was about government accountability, and throw a couple of the ideas and principles on the table from some of the work that she does as a prelude to our hearing the report of the Summer Government Accountability Committee. Anybody have any questions for Representative Stebbins, Representative Hooper, and then Waters Evans?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, I do beg your pardon if you mentioned this in your overview of the policy of the bill you put before us, but regarding the history of the planning office in Vermont, this isn't a new idea, right? This used to exist. From what years did it, for how long, and why did we scrap it?
Well, it was actually one of my constituents, Governor Howard Dean, who got rid of the government planning office. So I believe that was in the 80s. And I think it was around, it was not around for long. And so, I mentioned one of the questions of like the cost, how much money do you put into assessing an evaluation? Another question is, where does it sit? Does it sit under the executive branch? In my proposal, or rather in the bill that I co-sponsored in 2021, it was a new planning office. And one of the questions was, we don't know where it should sit. In H194, I put it, clearly, I'm suggesting clearly that it report to the legislature, because, after 2.5 years under my belt, I was like, I know that I voted on all these things, and I don't, unless I like dig through the websites or know who to ask for a report, then I may not know how whatever I voted on in 2021 has evolved. So it was a while ago. It was in the 80s, and Governor Dean got rid of it. I did ask him why about 1.5 years ago, but I can't remember his answer.
Wonder if we could get him to come in and testify.
Ooh.
He
All right,
might
well,
not
Scott, way
support
more
going
back. Thanks for the work.
We didn't have the tools we have today to really look back and collect data in the same way.
Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I'm wondering, so there's the summer government accountability committee, and it seems like I'm wondering if there's sort of piecemeal other groups, committees, organizations, maybe even not associated with the legislature or, the executive branch, but like a nonprofit or something are there any other kind of piecemeal organizations or committees that are doing this work somewhat already that could be? So I guess my follow-up would be, is there a way to combine them or get them to work together? Or is that just a puzzle that's too big to put together?
Well, I think this, a few answers. One, it sort of depends on what you're trying to look at. Like, for example, there are nonprofits that will dig into certain policy areas to see whether or not we are achieving the mandates that we've put into law. So I would say that that's a form of accountability, but that's probably specific to, child welfare or to clean energy policy or whatnot. Then we have other areas. I served on House Transportation my first 2 years, and the amount of dashboards and reporting and planning that they have to do for federal grants, etc. They do so much of it. But is it, and this is again where there's a bit of a rub. I said cost, and I said, who does the accountability report to? Another rub is, how do you make sure you're asking the questions that are going to give you the answers that are actionable? Because we can ask a lot of questions, but if you're not actually asking the right questions, then you've got a whole lot of data that you don't know whether or not, a certain policy is working. So that's another piece that I think, as you guys take this testimony and as you weigh through this, a key question, and it's probably great for, the co-chair who just walked in and is going to present on her work this summer. A key question is, how do you provide enough specificity, but then also flexibility so that as things change, our data collection, our evaluation approach can change. Ideally, we would have some form of higher level, ongoing sort of report cards at a frequent pace so that we can see the change. And then, we also have the opportunity to do a much deeper dive into specific programs or policy areas. But ideally, we would get that sort of ongoing dashboard tracker to see whether or not the work we're doing, the bills we're passing, the programs that we're asking the executive branch to implement, whether or not they're having the impact that we are striving for. So yes, long story short, Representative, there are many groups doing many of this, which is why one of the key areas here is coordination. That the H194 as drafted and your next witness, it's more specific to reporting to the legislature and providing the legislature the tools to assess accountability, which is a little different than whether or not you're trying to assess, like, if you're the Secretary of Transportation, whether or not you're trying to assess whether or not you've, met certain metrics. So that's another piece with the data and the evaluation that can vary depending on who's doing it.
So now that we have both of our co-chairs here, I want to pause here on 194 and thank Representative Stebbins for teeing that up and her patience with us getting around to this. And I hope that you feel better. So I want to hear from our Summer Government Accountability Committee. So thanks for being with us, Gabrielle. I appreciate being here.
Thanks so much, Chair. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
So would you like to come together, Senator Brock and Representative Brumsted? Please join us. We're anxious to hear the report out from your committee's work over the summer.
Representative Stebbins is gonna stay out. She can hear. Thanks.
I am. I also just wanted, I apologize as they're taking a seat. I wanted to say one last thing, which is this is sort of basic good business, is just being as efficient as we can with our scarce dollars. So hoping that we can really find a path forward.
Me too. Well, welcome, Senator Brock and Representative Brumsted. If you'd like to introduce yourselves and tell us about your work over the summer.
Let me start. I'm Randy Brock. I represent Franklin County and part of Grand Isle County in the Senate and the Senate Minority Leader.
And I'm Representative Brumsted, and I represent Shelburne and St. George, and I'm the co-chair of the House Human Services Committee.
Thanks for being here.
And we spent the better part of our summer on one particular project that I think is close and it becomes closer to our hearts. And I think it's a project that's important for the General Assembly as well. That is on the issue of accountability. You'll remember that we had a Government Accountability Committee that we put to rest in the last session. And we did so after a considerable period of time because I think many of us felt that we weren't accomplishing what was really intended to be accomplished. And one of those things that we were looking for is to help us deal better with the issue of accountability. Accountability is critically important for a legislative body because, you know, we pass tons of legislation. We enact lots of things. We spend horrendous amounts of money. And the question always comes at the end of it is, well, did we accomplish what we intended to? And we say, well, that's maybe something we'll look at the next session, but we have all this stuff that we have to deal with right now, and we go on and deal with the things we have to deal with now. And often we don't go back. One of the things that we tried with the other accountability committee was to provide training and information to people throughout the body to say, well, how should you look at legislation that you pass? How should you think about the issue of how to be more accountable in what we do? But when we look back, and the look back had to be informal because there wasn't a real process to look back, to say, well, did we accomplish that? Nobody was really able to say. That again was kind of a clue as to how effective our accountability process was. One thing that came out of it is we established kind of indirectly a process in which the administration came back and produces a series of reports to us that says what was accountability like for the administration as a whole for key programs. And we certainly looked at very often adding requirements for agencies of government to report back to the General Assembly on a date at some point in the future, information about what was done in conjunction with a piece of legislation that was passed. And I think for any of you who've been here for a period of time, you know that there is a pile of paper somewhere in a warehouse someplace in Montpelier that contains all of those reports, most of which we've never read. That again was an indication about government accountability, as so many things got asked for and reported upon, but reported upon often in such horrendous volume that none of us had time to read it, those of whom actually decided to go read it in the first place. And so we had a challenge in front of us. And one of the biggest part of that challenge was to define what do we mean by accountability? And is there something that we should do to look at accountability from a better lens than what we've looked at in the past? And one of the things that we started doing was looking at, well, gee, rather than reinvent the wheel, maybe somebody's figured out how to do this in some other state better than we have. And so that's the way, it's one of the places that we started. Representative Brumsted.
Sure. So we, as Senator Brack said, we did hear from about 15 different, through NCSL, the National Council of State Legislatures, we heard about 15 different states and what they were doing. And we sort of landed on Legistat. On New Mexico that had a program called Legistat. And what Representative Stebbins was talking about when I came in the room about asking the right questions in order to really get at, how do we measure and how do we collect the data we need to see whether or not we've met the goals of the legislation that we pass? And they have come up with a way by pulling together folks from both Joint Fiscal and Ledge Council to really focus on accountability. And so it might be a little similar with what Governor Dean sunsetted, it sounds like. But I also think that Governor Dean did that in the 80s, which was right about the time that Senator Snelling had gone off to a NCSL conference and came back with this whole, with what we were before, the Government Accountability Committee. And that legislation, you all just sunsetted, and it was around an outcomes report. And that was really a big new idea, right? And I think in some ways, what Representative Stebbins said about the boxes and, how are we meeting? What does it look like? Are we meeting all the things we wanted to? Is someone sort of checking that off? That's what the outcomes report was. And so now here we are 10 years later, sunsetting that, because that was more of a look. If you remember when I came here last year, that was more of a look back at what the executive branch was doing and what they, how healthy is our Vermonters, how, they were putting all the statistics together to try and see if those things were changing over time, which is great. But as far as the legislative branch goes, I think what we shot for was really looking at having a system of meaningful accountability for how tax dollars are spent. But we have all, I think, struggled to agree on an effective way to do that. So then, as Senator Brock said, we listened to NCSL, we heard from the auditor's office, we heard from Joint Fiscal, we heard from Ledge Council, we heard from the Office of, let's see if I can get it right, the Performance Office through the Governor's Office. And we heard from the Office of Racial Equity. So all of those folks, we heard a lot of testimony. Remember, you gave us 3 meetings to do this work in. We ended up going to the speaker and asking if we could have 4 meetings. And we did get our 4 meetings, but we didn't get to the second half or quite a bit of that, maybe even the second 3/4 of the questions. We really tried to stick to government accountability and oversight and look very closely at that. So we came up with some 11 common sense recommendations, allowing the legislatures and the public to keep track of what happens after a law is passed, how new legislation is implemented, how and when dollars are appropriated through budget process as expended. The other folks we talked to was LCAR, and we tried to come together on some changes that could be made right away. And a lot of that came through the auditor's office, and they are already doing it. So one of the things I would recommend to this committee is to hear from LCAR as well. They've made some substantive changes around how the rules are written, whether or not they're meeting legislative intent, and so forth. So I think that's really important as well. So the intent really is to re-examine the principle of government accountability by focusing on how evidence is used to inform policy, how state laws are carried out, and how our laws can best be written to achieve the intended outcomes. So those are sort of the big 3. And just as an example, right now up in the House Human Services Committee, we are moving forward on a bill that came to us from the Senate to ban all flavored tobacco and e-cigarettes. It's really aimed at the zillions of kids who are using flavored e-cigarettes in schools. And 4 years ago, we passed legislation that raised the age to 21, that said no internet sales, just like we don't have any internet sales for cigarettes either. So for e-cigarettes, and we, raised the taxes to the same as what we were charging for cigarettes for e-cigarettes. And so we did those three things. That we still have more and more people, more and more kids using e-cigarettes in our schools. So my point to our committee was, okay, before we start taking up the Senate bill, let's look back at that legislation. Let's hear from the Attorney General's office and say, hey, are we following up on some of these things that we already know that kids aren't supposed to have e-cigarettes, right? And we hear that the Attorney General has some really good information to share with us. We're also following up with the Department of Liquor and Lottery and saying, are you guys doing the secret shopper? Are you going into our stores and asking the questions and making sure that we're not selling to kids under 21? So my point is just that we need, as committees also, not only are we talking in these recommendations about setting up possibly an office that would be oversight and accountability office, but with a legislative committee that would work together with this office, as well as to work together with the committees. And the committees would then have the ability to think about that when they take on new legislation. So before they take on something new, let's look back and see what we already have. And I think Leg Council, we actually had Legislative Council Carby, Jen Carby, come in today to talk about what I was just talking about, but the e-cigs. And I think it was really helpful. Everyone around the table was like, oh, that's what we did 4 years ago. Okay, so how much do we need to do today? So I think that it would be helpful to do that. I also thought that it might be helpful now to, if you pulled up our report, we could just go over the 11 things and see if you have any questions, because Senator Brock and I both have sort of lived and breathed these 11 recommendations, and you can find them under other. So if you committees. So if you go to committees.
We have them on.
Oh, you have them on.
Page for today's
Oh,
testimony. And just there's a letter that's the kind of the cover letter. But then I believe the document we should be looking at is the summer GAC recommendations draft 3.7 that were adopted on December 13th, it looks like.
Yes, and I think I'm on page 3 that has that list of 11. If you want to just pull them up, and maybe we can just sort
Well,
of.
the question is which draft, the document, the summer GAC recommendations is draft 3.6 dated 12/13.
This one
We
doesn't
have
have that.
3.7 dated 12/13 on our
Yeah.
page right now. I
Yeah,
assume
that's the right one.
Yeah, the final edited one.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
I just want to make sure we're.
Yeah, definitely. And you'll see at the back of this report,
Yep.
we actually put the slides from New Mexico because we thought they were so helpful.
Yep.
Okay, so the first one is obvious. We talk about this all the time, educating members of the General Assembly on the importance of government accountability, right? We talk, and interrupt me anytime if you have a question, or Senator Buck, so that we can help you all think about each of these. But you know what? You could ask the question, well, haven't you always been doing that? Yes, we have. And we don't usually get that many members. So the idea again is to really put another foot forward to encourage lots of our new members especially, but all of our members to talk about this. And as we move through these, you'll see that there are a lot of other changes that will be important for everyone to understand as they go forward, if you decide to take something like this up.
There's a linkage between simply the notion of educate and actually achieving some results from that education. First, to talk about the concepts and methodologies to deal with the government accountability generally. And we touched on that in the education that was presented by the last committee, but also training in data-informed decision-making, and then also the creation of some tools that could be used on a replicating basis throughout legislation that we construct so that we have some consistency in what we do. So people are tied in to looking for particular things that would help measure the results and outcomes of legislation that we pass.
This is the government accountability equivalent of how we in here look for a sunset for every board and commission that gets set up in those, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So 2 is create a joint government oversight and accountability committee. And that wouldn't be a policy committee that would meet during the regular time. Just so you know, each one of these, so there are 11. And then if you go back through the report, each one has all kinds of examples and other information next to it. But what we were thinking here is a committee that would probably meet in the summer and fall regularly, would work alongside or with some input from the auditor's office, as well as with the joint, if we are able to put funding into some new staff that just works on oversight and accountability with committees through joint fiscal and ledge council, that this committee then would work with them off cycle, off when we're not in session.
And one of the things that we saw from looking at the work done in other states, particularly those whose state auditors also are involved in an oversight function, is that reports are created under government auditing standards about issues and things to look at, things to improve, things that have created problems elsewhere. But there are mechanisms to ensure that there in fact is follow-up. Right now, Vermont has a void. There can be audit findings and audit findings of significance. Most of the time, those findings are resolved, but not always. And you certainly have situations in which audit agencies say, well, we don't agree with that audit, and things die on the vine and don't get looked at further. There isn't a mechanism to continue the oversight process to the extent that it should be. And as a result, significant issues potentially die on the vine. What we're designing here, or talking about designing here, is a mechanism not just to provide accountability, but also to provide oversight so that the legislature is kept apprised of things that are open, things that are problem areas, things that may blow up at our faces so that we're aware of it, and also provides a mechanism to follow up to the extent that is necessary, again, with some controls and guidelines to do that.
So an example of that is the auditor finding that some of our dams might not have been meeting the safety requirements. And so what happens to that report? Who's looking at it? Who's making sure that in a year, there's some change, that the funds are there and they're actually being spent inside of government to fix those problems?
And then there are also issues that happen in the past that can potentially be embarrassing to people either in the General Assembly or in the administration. And I certainly, as a former state auditor, I've seen this many times in which people don't really want to look back at things that will embarrass them. And as a result, they don't often get looked back to the depth that they should. And this provides an oversight mechanism to ensure that we do in fact look back. And it provides a level of look back control so that this committee doesn't have the ability to go and create a major investigation of some kind, again, without authority and the permission to do so. But it says this group can look at some things that get referred to it, whether through audit or otherwise, and recognize that when we talk about audit, we aren't just talking about audits that are done by the state auditor's office. We have lots of auditors in state government, provided by agencies of the federal government, for example, who provide audits and provide audit reports. Question is there a place that goes to from a legislative perspective that provides oversight to it? And this provides a mechanism for that to happen also.
And so then number 3, it builds on that, right, as to where's the staff coming from? And it's to define a policy, planning, and program evaluation staff function to assist the General Assembly with improved accountability. So that's that coming from Joint Fiscal Ledge Council together to help us with that work, both in committee and outside of committee.
There's consumed.
I'm
So
making
both-
notes. Representative Cooper, go ahead. Sorry.
It seems like with what Mr. Former Auditor just said and the continuation of this, that there's getting to be a pretty fine line between the administration's responsibility to carry out the will of the legislature and our ability to just say, here's the money, go do what we said. how do you deal with that? I mean, we seem to be enforcing something that we may traditionally not have the authority to do.
I think that that fine line is exactly what's here. Don't we do that now? We sort of do this now. We come back in January and we say, oh, how come we didn't spend that money on the housing in Bennington, but we approved it? And so and then we receive reports. We might receive a report from the federal government that goes through the auditor's office and ends up in a committee that says all kinds of things that we should be doing. I'm trying to think of a good example. The Child Care Financial Assistance Program had been told when they were audited that they didn't, their IT systems were not up to speed. So we made sure through the appropriations process that that money kept funneling into the Agency of Human Services, Department of Children and Families in order to upgrade that. And it wasn't happening. And we didn't realize truly that they were not in compliance. And so this is an opportunity, rather than just as we do now, which is sort of walk on both sides of that line, trying to figure it out, even though we're a part-time legislature. This is an opportunity to really look to have systems in place that make it so that individual legislators don't have to remember it on their own. So the CCFAP plan problem that came up, I knew about it. And I don't know if you remember, Representative Trieber was the one who had told me in appropriations. And so we kept asking those questions, right? But if both of us had left office at the same time, the systems weren't really in place to make sure that people were asking those questions based on these sort of things being in place. And that's what we're really saying, that there is a fine line, but we're trying to figure out how best to follow through without it being about the individual sitting in our system.
And it's in most states that you looked at, it is a legislative watchdog as opposed to a separate inspector general sort of organization.
Well, the legislature in many of the states that we looked at did have a mechanism, often a legislative audit office, for example, in which the reports by these outside agencies went to one place in the legislature. This is not exclusive, but one of the things that legislatures did is to look at whether or not the legislation they passed was being implemented and the processes they put in place were in fact being followed. And then it gave them the ability to have sufficient information to be able to ask the questions that legislators typically ask when they talk with agencies or others who are involved with the implementation of programs. It also was designed to help legislators look at, was the legislation passed sufficient? Was it working? Was it doing what was intended? And is there something else we should do? It helps answer questions, and that's the real goal. It's not designed to replace anybody else.
Okay, and then the next one is adjust the timing of the programmatic and performance measures budget report as well as other reports. We just noticed, and this again is something to take testimony on, but we really noticed that the budget really is it's 1 year, right? We know there's a beginning and an end, but do you have to look at it at the beginning or the end? Could you look at it when it makes sense? So if you always look at it in October, then it's still 1 year that you're looking at it in October, so that by January, you're prepared and ready to go, is a question that I think is important for you all to think about. Like, why do we stick to certain deadlines when we know how difficult they are to meet for both sides? So that's
In particular, you may get a legislative report that is delivered to the General Assembly on January 15th. But in order to prepare a budget to deal with it, you have to have the information well in advance so that the information is useful in the construction of that budget, which is actually going to be delivered in January. The fact that we have information coming in at various points in time is rather than having some consistency in having reporting dates that match the actual need for the information. That's the piece that seems to be missing. And what we're saying is perhaps if there is more consistency in this and more thought given to when reports are delivered to us to act on, we might be able to produce better end results.
Put it all together. 5 is increased consistency and accountability in rulemaking with support from the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. And that's the one that I said, they've already started some of these changes that both we recommended and the auditor has recommended. So I think it'll be important for you all to hear from LCAR.
We do have Representative Higley here, who is our ambassador to LCAR and serves on both this committee and LCAR.
Great. Okay, number 6, develop processes, checklists, and timelines to ensure all key legislative reports and deadlines are easily accessible to the General Assembly and the public. And that's that once we do have work completed that shows how we're doing, that it's actually somewhere on our website accessible to the public, as well as to legislators who maybe didn't sit on that committee or didn't realize that had happened, or they're new and they want to check out how we're doing in different areas. We don't really have that anywhere on our website. It's pretty much dependent on what you know you're going after to look for. But if you're just a member of the public, it's really hard to find information about our accountability. Number 7, establish a process to ensure that committee members and committee staff regularly and formally review past legislation, legislative mandated reports, and other materials. I think we've talked about that a lot. Number 8, establish a process that allows House and Senate committees dealing with issues related to appropriations, institutions, and transportation. And the reason for those 3 committees, these are money committees, to follow up on the previous year's budget with historical data. So the idea being that rather than, for those of you, I'm not sure if this committee works on the budget, but most policy committees work on the budget. So our House Human Services Committee, we look at the policy decisions that are made or not made based on how much money is appropriated, right? So this idea is that we wouldn't, right now, the way, when we look at the budget, a lot of it is around the ups and downs, but not those things that happen to stay same. It might have been that they went down or up, but not by the end of the year, they were back on the same line. And so we miss a lot of information, right, overall. And then the real question is, shouldn't we be looking at 3 or 4 years back and see what's happening? We do get some information like that when we look closely at the budget. We see some bar graphs and things like that, but it would be, what we'd really like is the big numbers to be over time so that we can actually see how things are changing in government over time. That one's a harder one, and I think you'd have to hear from the appropriations, but we did see some evidence of this in the New Mexico bills. It seemed like it was a lot of the questions that were posed by staff in the Joint Fiscal Office were around over time. They weren't very specific to last year and this year, just looking at like the 23 and 24 budget. They were looking back to the 20 budget, that sort of thing. And then number 9, is that right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Establish a process for committees to monitor and report upon deadlines relevant to enacted legislation. And so that's in our committee. We passed the big child care bill last year. We made sure that our committee assistant has all written down into our timeline when every report is due, and if it's not in, checking on it, that sort of thing. But really making that a systemic, something we do in every committee. It's not all the same. The other thing is Legislative Council does a report at the end of the year that summarizes all of our laws that were signed by the governor. And in it, they have a chart that shows when everything is due to be done from that law. But it doesn't just go in a structural way to every committee. Like Legislative Council doesn't always come into every committee and explain that is specific to the bills and the laws that they worked on. Some committee chairs encourage it and go ask for it. Others don't. And so again, back to my point of it shouldn't matter who's sitting in these seats. it should just be a process so that everyone gets used to that happening and is able to respond if they would like. So number 10 is require a performance note for legislation that is a priority or costs more than a threshold dollar amount. This is a big one. And
Huge one.
if you look back here into your section by section, if you go to 10, you'll see, my pages aren't numbered, but I bet your pages are. Is it for you?
No, I don't think your pages are numbered. Well, I have it on the PDF. I have it's page 11. Has
Does it say number 10 at the bottom? I have it at the very bottom. Okay, and then when you go over to A, B, and C, and D, you'll see that this is that if you are doing legislation, that you have a clear statement of legislative intent, the overall goals, and the changes anticipated, a description of expectations and timelines for these expectations, how you're going to collect the data in order to measure results and evaluate whether the legislation is having its intended impact, including its impact on specific populations, an entity designated by the General Assembly, preferably one that is independent and nonpartisan, to be responsible for data collection, monitoring, and reporting back to the General Assembly on the progress associated with the policy changes and investments. And it could be this new group of staff that we've been talking about, right? That would help us to walk through this on legislation in the committee room, but then also would help us to look back when we get to the next step.
We talk a lot, which we do, and I'm sure you all see the kind of fiscal notes that Joint Fiscal prepares for us to give us an idea about costs and estimates. And what this is something somewhat similar, a performance note. It tells us if we're going to pass this bill, and this isn't for every bill, this is for key bills or certain bills perhaps that pass the financial threshold. Something that tells what is it we're trying to achieve. If we did achieve it, what would it look like? How could we measure that achievement, and how could we put numbers to it if there is an issue of cost or return on investment? And then how do we monitor it? And one of the things, if you've been here for a while and you hear a lot of agencies come in to tell you about how they do, they typically don't come in and say, we really messed this up. We missed our budget target. We didn't save any money. We added a lot of staff that didn't stay. A lot of things went wrong. That's a lesson that you rarely hear. But those in some cases are lessons that are real. And that's why we say, ideally, the answers that we get to those questions should be done by someone who has a degree of independence to be able to tell us without necessarily having ownership of the problem. And there again, there's some suggestions about how to achieve that.
And a good example of that is, again, I have to always draw from my committee because that's where my examples are, but the childcare bill. We worked really hard to make sure that there was an entity that is going to collect the data to show whether or not this bill is having its intended impact. It was a leadership priority last year, so it would fit in this qualification, right? It cost money, it was a new tax. I mean, all of those things. And so we put Building Bright Futures, that is a quasi-public-private independent group in charge of, they do qualitative and quantitative research with 14 groups from all over the state, talking with parents, families, providers, all of it, and really are able to track down and are helping us to come up. Right now, I think on January 15th, they're going to be releasing a report to the legislature that shows what they're going to be tracking, how they're going to track those things. And they just came into our committee the other day, and already it's only been 6 months and we've created over 100 new spots in childcare spots all over Vermont, especially in some of our most rural areas, Newport, St. Johnsbury, all kinds of areas. And we wouldn't have that information if we hadn't built it into the legislation. So it benefits all of us, not just it makes so much sense to be able to look and say, it worked. This is working after just 6 months. And they're going to be giving us updates every year for the next 10 years to be able to show. And this will help us tweak the bill if it's not going quite right. If we find a problem, we'll see it. We'll see it in the data. how, I can't imagine anything better than that. So I have to say that this number 10 is my favorite.
I just ask, the idea isn't that we would do a performance note if we're doing like some procedural tweak to election policy. This
Yeah.
is when we're creating a revenue source and a big program and we're trying to impact thousands of families on a huge thing like childcare. Then we want to collect data and we want to understand who it's coming from and who's going to be held accountable, who's collecting it.
Exactly, like housing. Wouldn't it be nice to have all that kind of information on all the things that, all the, what we've done so far in housing? We put in a huge amount of money, but we don't have a huge amount of information to help us understand it. And I think that that's the point. The other thing is some little things we might want to know. Some of this data we might want to have, for example, this tobacco bill won't be a huge cost. It'll actually be pretty low because it shouldn't impact taxes too much. We will lose a little maybe, but we do want to know, is it helping us to reduce the number of kids who are using e-cigarettes? And there are many other questions we have too. So it's important for everyone, I think, to take some responsibility for looking at what they introduce. And if it were to pass, would they want to be able to tell people in their district or in this state how it has impacted the state? I think, don't we all want that in the long run? And even if it comes out, as Senator Brock said, if it comes out not quite what you had thought, like, oh, there's no new spots being created in childcare. Okay. Why not? What's going wrong? Are we not paying enough? Are we, right? So then we can still make amendments. That's the wonderful part. Or we can sunset a bill and start over. But at least we'll have some data to make our decisions with. And that's really what I believe this is all about.
As we look at the tobacco as the classic example, is we want to know what's the effect on the sale of tobacco. We also want to know what's happening in neighboring states, and particularly in those states that abut Vermont and those communities that abut Vermont. Are their sales rising? And are the numbers such that you can see that we haven't really made much of a dent at all? I hope that isn't the case, but that is one of the things that we should be looking for. We should be looking for information that helps us validate that what we did was the right thing, or if what we did was not the right thing, is not working, to help us correct a course before we spend large amounts of time and large amounts of money on something that isn't working.
And so number 11 is just simply define and right size the overall staffing necessary for the legislative branch to carry out the recommendations of this report. So, and it gives you in each one where we should be looking or hearing testimony. It would just help. Mostly these are written in a way that hopefully will help you all to know where to hear testimony from in order to be able to make the best decisions you can make, of course. And so it goes through each of the recommendations and where you might want to. I think finally, very, very important is the last section that's on recommendations addressing 2023 acts and resolves, number 53, section 2A. And these are the questions that you asked us to answer around equity and inclusion and sunsetting. You know, those were the well, it says it right here. It gave the Summer Committee on Government Accountability a very broad charge and initially only 3 meetings. The committee focused its initial meetings on this first charge, which is what we've been talking about, of creating systems within the General Assembly to increase accountability. But the second through the 4th charges focused on composition, appointment, and compensation of boards and commissions, and are an entirely separate body of work from the first charge. The committee is grateful for the attention and effort of the Office of Racial Equity's Executive Director, Susanna Davis, for bringing these issues to the committee's attention at both its November 3rd and December 13th meetings. But given our limited time, I mean, we had 4 meetings, and as you can see, we did quite a bit in 4 meetings. We're available to meet these ambitious legislative charges by mandated deadline and the profound importance of these volunteer positions to our state's functioning. The committee recommends the following next steps, and those are for you all. And honestly, if I were you, I guess I'm sitting in this chair, so I get to say it one time, which is I would put these in their own bill separate from government accountability, because government accountability is is something different. And both have equally incredible importance to the way things work, but they're different. And so I'd put them into two bills if it were me. That's it.
Questions for our co-chairs, Representative Pango?
This is not a question. This is something I've expressed to each of them individually. But I found this to be one of the most compelling reports that we've ever been presented with, because it really specifies actions that we should take. And I feel like it's all really common sense. And some of it I don't believe that we really aren't doing, but aren't doing already, but it's understandable when you think about how much turnover there is, both with legislators, with staff, and how reports could just get lost, even though they're well-intended that people will read them. So I really appreciate the work that you did, and can't believe you did it all in 4 meetings. It's amazing. Thank you.
I am cognizant that we were referred a bill, and I had that on the agenda today, H702. Did I get the number right? Which I believe the House members of the committee all co-sponsored, and it is a short form bill that I think, I know Legislative Council is not here, but if I'm not mistaken, it just says adopt the recommendations that are in the report that you all walked us through. So I think, you know, for us as the committee, I'd like to take the next step
And actually start to flush some of this out outside of the bounds of our committee room and honor the work that you all did this summer and try to
turn 702 into a vehicle to enact these recommendations. I think the recommendations are clear, and I really value all of the work that you put in. I also know that it is going to be a challenge, I think, to get them into legislative language where we can get consensus and actually move it all forward. So we've got some work ahead of us to dive into this, but it's one of the things that I think we set you all out some work. You've come back with good specific recommendations, and it's our obligation to do our best this year to try to make some progress in these areas. I don't know if other folks on the committee, if there's anything you're particularly excited to work on, but I'd love to get, and we don't have to do this right now, but if there are 2 or 3 or 4 of us that want to work on the language and consult with Senator Brock and Representative Burmisen and say, is this really what you meant by that? Legislative Council and try in the next couple of weeks to get 702 kind of fleshed out. I would appreciate volunteers to help with that work because it's going to be a lift.
I'm happy to help too.
That's fine.
And I'm guessing you're gonna get time in the Senate to do that, but I think the House is gonna start, right? Is that correct?
What's that?
You're gonna start the bill here
Yes.
and send it over.
Yeah, it's our, Senator Hardy and I began a tradition last year, and we've both, House and Senate GovOps have worked well then on some of these bills that are kind of priorities for both bodies, where we kind of know one body's going to start and then the other committee will get to finish. We've been able to sort of divvy up some of that work pretty well. And I drew taking the first crack at taking your recommendations and getting them through the drafting process. So this will be, I think, the House side going first, and we'll do our best to give you all something over in the Senate, Senator Brock, that you can not have to sand down too much.
I think definitely maybe next, hear from New Mexico. I think you'd be interested in what they did, and they might be able to help you with legislative language. And also, we had Tim Devlin from Legislative Council. Is that who you'll have? So he knows that too. And if you look at our webpage, you know, when you go to committees, then go to other, and then under that, Summer Government Accountability Committee, we have a lot of slide decks from, I think, like 12 different states. So you could look at that as well. And if something, you know, the nice part is if you do maybe do small groups working on 3 or 4 of them, you know, like separate out the recommendations and have it kind of like what we do on the budget. And we do it outside of the committee room, and then we bring our stuff together and talk about what we found. Then you could look at some of those different states and say, oh, in this area, this state has some good ideas. And oh, in that area, this state. I mean, I've been thinking about this late at night, you know. So how on earth do you get on top of all that you would have to do? And that's just an idea, because you don't have to, I don't think you have as much of a lift during budget sessions. So this might be an opportunity, that would be a good time to do it the way we do it during budget. We still have stuff going on in our committee. We still hear testimony, but we're all off on our own in small groups of 2 or 3 doing work on a couple of the areas. So you could do it something like that. Just an idea.
I appreciate the suggestions. It's, there's a lot here. And I also am glad that there are other states that have gone forward that you're saying, yeah, these models look like we want to emphasize. I had the opportunity to meet the appropriations chair from New Mexico last summer, and they have a very different style of how they do business in New Mexico, but some really impressive ways of thinking about how to organize their legislative work, and not surprised that they have a model that we can crib from.
What's nice with their legislative council there is the legislative council actually helps them to think of the questions too. Like as they work through a new bill, they'll say, you know, okay, so what are the goals here? What is the legislative intent? It does make a difference when you're asked those questions. It forces everyone at the table to think about it.
Any final questions for our co-chairs?
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting us. And this is a fun project, but it's critically important. And you know, it really isn't that complicated. Once you sit back and you think about, gee, wouldn't it be nice to know what it is we're trying to achieve in this bill? And wouldn't it be great to really understand, did we do it? That is complicated when you really think about it to its fundamentals.
Well, I think what you're suggesting here standardizes the questions, and it seeks to create mechanisms where there's a culture of continually coming back to those same questions to check back in and make sure that we're actually doing the things that we set out to do in legislation. And it's that not being victims of the immediacy of whatever the next thing is, the next thing. And I think
one of the things we also talked about was the ability to have some immediacy in our reporting on the one hand, to the extent possible, and second, to have clarity. We have this tendency in government, as you know, to produce 450-page reports that no one reads. But really understanding whether something works and whether or not something does what's intended can often be expressed pretty simply. And the key to people understanding, reading, and appreciating it was the ability to express it simply. And that sometimes is hard to do without thought.
You are reminding me, Senator Brack, that Tucker Anderson of Legislative Council has compiled the list of reports that are up for a repeals review. And that those, we haven't done that whole process in a few years, so it's a little backed up. I believe there are 140 candidate reports that the chairs of the relevant committees of jurisdictions have all received a very organized spreadsheet, description of those reports, and been asked to weigh in with their committees and give feedback to us to compile a list of reports that may be ready to go off into the sunset. So I think the timing is good, and there's a little bit of a parallel there. So we're going to try to be about efficiency and accountability and just doing a little bit of government house cleaning this year in a way that maybe we don't always take a step back and do so. This is the year for that here in GovOps. So I appreciate you doing all of this work with us, and we will definitely be contacting both of you for help and guidance as we try and get into the drafting process on this. So great. Well, committee, we will be back here at 9 tomorrow, and we'll let our co-chairs go. I don't think there's anything. Yeah, yeah, I think we're picking up our harder work, but I don't think there's any big announcements or anything that I need to make. So I will wish you all a good evening. Thanks for the good